Hello, and welcome to ZTV Live. Today is Tuesday, October 20th, 2020. 10/20/2020 for all you number fans out there. Tonight we have Reading, Writing, and Ralph. Our literary editor, Ralph Peluso, is here with his guest, Paula Green, who wrote a wonderful book, The Great Virginia Flood of 1870. So for all of you history buffs, there's a well-researched book, and we will get to that in just one second. I do want to let you know, as you could tell from the different camera scenes in the beginning, the our software is being a little not cooperative tonight, and so forgive us and bear with us as we work through the cameras. But for right now, I'm going to bring Ralph Peluso on, our literary editor. Hi, Ralph. Welcome to
Hi, Susan.
welcome back. How are you?
Great, Susan. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing okay. I
Fabulous.
am happy to have you here, and I know that you have been looking forward to this interview.
Yes, I have, and it's a terrific book. It's a history book, but it's written as if it's a novel. And there are parts of it you get a really great feeling of as if you're there, and it's wonderfully done by a nice young author, uh, uh, Paula Green. And why don't we bring her on?
Sure, let's get her on here. Hi, Paula. You're on ZTV Live.
Hi, Ralph and Susan. I'm thrilled to be talking with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, Paula. Well,
Glad to have you here. I'm going to let you guys take it away from here.
Yes. Yeah, glad you can make it. And I know we set this up, seems like forever ago, but here we are. It's already October 20th, 2020. And I'd like to start out by asking our authors to give the viewers their background so they can get to know you a little bit better as a person and as well as an author.
Well, thank you. I work in the JMU libraries in the Interlibrary Loan Office, and I get to track down obscure materials every day, which is so much fun. And I love doing research, and so that's it's wonderful to be in a job where I'm allowed to do that. I have my master's degree in public history and my undergraduate in anthropology with a concentration in archaeology, and so all of that background kind of shapes how I look at history and try to write about it.
Great. So let me ask you a question. So what's the most obscure item you've had to run down?
Okay, it was an uncatalogued score from Albania.
A baseball score or like a musical score?
It was a musical score.
Okay.
And so there were no holdings for it on OCLC, and I ended up researching the composer, found a library in his hometown, and just kind of did a shot in the dark request out there, and they had it and were willing to send it to us. So that was the best one.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Your face just lights up when you talk about that stuff. So, tell our viewers how you came to this subject of the Virginia flood of 1870, and then wanting to write about it.
Okay. Yes. So I ended up moving to Page County in 1996, and that was the year that Hurricane Fran happened. And so Page County just flooded horribly. And my mom's side of the family is from that area. And my granddad ended up telling me stories about the 1870 flood because of, what was going on at that point in time. And something about that, it just kind of like, was in the back of my head. And years later, I decided I wanted to look up and find out more about it. And so I ended up getting out the microfilm for the Page News and Courier, and finding this story about about what happened there. And I was just kind of blown away at the language and how devastating it was to that area. And this was 5 years after the Civil War that it happened, and it was in many ways like that at least the coverage at the time claimed that it was much more devastating economically than the burning of the valley and things of that nature. And so that piqued my curiosity. And then when I found out how widespread it was, I wanted to know more. And so it ended up being a research passion.
Wow. Wow. So, what are some of the major takeaways that the readers would have after going through your book?
Well, I really wanted to be able to tell the stories of those who were impacted, especially the marginalized voices that didn't always have their stories told. So I'm hoping that folks come away looking at a little bit more of a diverse telling of this story. And also, there were only a couple like localized histories that even had anything in the history books on it. So this, I'm hoping that, you know, it is a much broader tale and digs into all of those like little details. And I'd also like people to look at the subject of relief and how it has changed over time, and like the necessity of having federal programs like FEMA, you know, that do help out, because at that point in time it was really relying on the generosity of your neighbors and people that were willing to donate to a fund to distribute, which in the end really does it rather fails. You know, so
Yeah,
yeah.
that's a tough rely on.
Yeah.
We're gonna get into some of the chapters and some of the stories, but I wanted to let the audience know that there will be 2 trivia questions tonight, where you can win an autographed copy of Paula's book, the Virginia Flood of 1870. But I'm going to have one trivia question as a warm-up, and I'd like to see how many respondents we can get with the right answer, but this will get the viewers in the mood for a discussion about a flood. So the first question is, in Sebastian Junger's novel, The Perfect Storm, what was the name of the boat that got sunk by the perfect storm? So we will announce everyone who got it right within the next 5 minutes, let's say. All right. So your book, the writing of this book, puts the viewer on scene, and you get a feel for what was going on in each of the counties, in each of the locations. So why don't you talk about your most favorite chapter or story in the book?
Oh, that's tough. Since it is such a tragedy, so many of the stories are really dark, and I think I like the stories of rescue, of, you know, the bright spots that are in the dark, you know. So one of my favorites is about a gentleman in Harper's Ferry whose name was James T. Reed, and essentially he goes. When the flood happens there, he goes to his place of business and is trying to save papers, and he realizes, you know, that as the waters are rising so quickly, he's not going to be able to do much to save his business, and so he leaves that and notices all of these people on the street that that were in need of rescue. And so essentially he hops on his horse and he starts, you know, kind of hoisting people up against this barrier wall and saving all a bunch of people on Shenandoah Street in Harper's Ferry. And he's very diligent about it. It's not just a whim to just, you know, help a couple people. He actually, his horse gets tired out. He has to change horses and goes back onto the street and continues to rescue folks from that area, you know, until it becomes, you know, too dangerous to be down there. So that's one of them. There's another one out of Lynchburg, where the morning after the flood, there was a guy named Toby Royal, and he and 2 other folks end up in a boat and spending the entire day rescuing people off of rooftops, and I think they rescued close to 20 people throughout the day doing that. So I think that those are good rescue stories, and I like that. And then, you know, in page over and over there are these stories of people being trapped in floodwaters and watching their neighbors come together and like literally build boats on the shore to come out and get them, which just, kind of blows my mind to like have that craftsmanship to go and get the lumber and build these things and to take care of your neighbors in that fashion.
Just incredible. Just incredible. And reading them and seeing some of the rescue stories where people are holding on to things as they're in the rushing water is just amazing. But it takes almost near perfect weather and environmental conditions to cause something of this. And you talk about that in your book. So why don't you describe the conditions that existed prior to the rainstorm?
Absolutely. Well, the storm took place at the end of September / the beginning of October in 1870, and at that point, Virginia had been in a drought for at least several weeks, and so the necessity of rain was getting dire at that point. And I believe it was a newspaper in Charlottesville commented that the dust in the streets had started to reach about 4 inches in places, and it was just dusty, cracked ground, and the people were. It was starting to get dire. And so and at that point in time, industry also ran off of the water. So when the water level was so low on the rivers, you couldn't run the mills, and travel was impacted in certain ways, and so it impacted so many aspects of life. So once the rain started, people were very excited. Hey, it's raining, and then it didn't stop. It became it was likely the remnants of a tropical storm, but since this is pre the Weather Service, we actually do not have formal records on it, and in fact the precursor of the National Weather Service started November 1st of that year, so it's like right before we get any form of record. That's kind of.
Yeah, I think one of the things you touched about that caught my attention in describing the pre-storm conditions was that there was no produce available. And when you think about that, because, it's a lot of farmland, and there's
Right.
nothing available. I mean,
Yeah, it was at least starting to get pretty dire in like the bigger cities like Richmond. There was a lack of produce. There still was some, but it was very slim pickings, and so there were kind of complaints about that there was just not that diversity of produce that yeah.
So this is an era before the National Weather Service, before NOAA, before any of that stuff.
Mhm.
So, and again, you mentioned to me a very, very interesting tidbit, how people communicated from city to city and town to town that the flood was coming.
Yes.
So tell us how they did that.
Well, some places didn't have a warning at all, but generally speaking, like if you knew a flood was coming, that you would send a telegraph out and let the neighboring cities know that something was on the way. And for years, Harper's Ferry, would warn Georgetown and Washington D.C. that a flood was on the way, from the Potomac and the Shenandoah confluence there, and the flood hit Harper's Ferry. They got a telegraph probably. Oh, maybe it was about 15 minutes before the flood hit there, and they were still trying to verify if it was true when the water starts coming in, and the water rises so quickly there that they get focused on rescue efforts, and someone forgets to send a telegram out to Georgetown, so when the water reached there the next day, there was no warning. And so and it wasn't as bad in Georgetown, but it was still significant enough that all of the vendors along the wharf area were having to move things up to higher ground, and it impacted the cities lower on the river. But Harper's Ferry was it was such devastation there. A lot of the industry and houses were along lower parts of the river and hadn't been, flooded to that extent, and so there were brick houses that were more substantial that they thought would, probably survive this flood that were often just kind of it was taken out by debris, and tragically there was an awful lot of death in that location, and yeah.
But in some cases, they also used a form of communication even more archaic, right?
Oh, yes. So, yeah, prior to the telegraph, Harper's Ferry used to send riders out to Georgetown. And so that was very reliable because I guess there was a designated person or persons that would hop on their horse and go. And once they had the telegraph, that was just that wasn't something they were doing anymore. So it just crossed everyone's mind, and in the midst of this tragedy, nobody thought to warn further down the river for that, which kind of juxtaposes kind of interestingly with Lynchburg and Richmond, because Lynchburg, the flood was hitting there about 10 p.m. at night, and they got a telegraph out right before the lines went down. And I found this obscure note in the Valentine Museum that said that it either had that the lines were already kind of down in some places, so to get that message to Richmond, it either had to be routed through Tennessee or Georgia to actually get to Richmond. And so just this phenomenal effort to even get the message to them. And then once they received it, they had about 12 hours notice that a flood was coming. Wow. And they were able to kind of prepare by moving property, and there were lots of goods in the tobacco warehouses along the James were massive at that point. So there were people employed with moving those goods out, and luckily because of that specific telegraph, no lives were lost at Richmond. So I mean that was a really important thing that happened there.
So I can just visualize these Paul Revere-like kind of guys riding through the valley saying, "Flood is coming."
Yeah.
So, do we have any winners on that first one yet?
We do have winners on the first one. We have the very first winner. It was Kelly McConomy. Came up, and the correct answer, of course, was the Andrea Gale. So Kelly McConomy got the correct answer. Michelle D'Amato, Nancy Campbell-Gorski, and Nancy Parlett. So
all right.
Some of our best fans. So thank you, everybody, for listening and paying attention, and wait for the next question.
So we're going to give them the next question. Now that they're all warmed up and they have their trivia hats on, the next question, which is for an autographed copy of the Great Virginia Flood of 1870, which bridge that crosses the Potomac and destroyed by the flood of 1870, of course, was rebuilt using federal funds? So let's see who the first one is with the correct answer, and they will get an autographed copy of Paula's book. So yeah. Paula, let's talk about Harper's Ferry, because that seems to be one of the places you love to talk about. And there's some amusing stories in Harper's Ferry as well, aren't there?
There's one in particular that there was an elderly gentleman named John Warnweg, and it was his 76th birthday when the flood occurred. And he was this famous machinist. His father was Louis Warnweg, who built these incredible bridges in the late 18th, early 19th century. And so they were a well-known family. And Mr. Warnweg spent his birthday in his machine shop. So he was working along, and then the flood kind of rose around him, and it was too late for him to escape. But the shop holds out, and that Saturday morning, that's when the machine shop just lifts from from its foundation and starts to go down the river. And about the time it hits the Potomac area, it hits a piece of debris and just smashes. And all of these people are watching from the hills surrounding Harper's Ferry and, are really, really worried. And so within a couple seconds, Mr. Wormwood comes back up. He's this spry older gentleman, and these two joists of his machine shop, he's able to get a hold of them, kind of put together a raft. He grabs this other windowsill and kind of, positions it so he's sitting on these essentially rafters, if you will, of his former machine shop, and he starts to go down the river. And there's no way for anyone to get to him. And so he just waves goodbye to everyone as he floats on down. And, there's kind of this, like sinking feeling like, oh my gosh, is he going to make it, because he has to go over the rapids that are known as the Bull Ring right outside of Harper's Ferry. And so he makes it over those, but he gets out of sight of the town. So there's all this kind of these nerves about, is he okay? He gets down to what was Berlin, Maryland. I think it's Brunswick, Maryland now, and was rescued there. And so he takes the train back up to Harper's Ferry, and by the end of the day, he's back at his hometown. And so,
what a way to celebrate his birthday.
Yeah, quite a birthday. Yeah.
But let's talk about Richmond for a little bit, because that was hit pretty hard too.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
What's the perspective on the Richmond events and how that unfolded?
Richmond is Richmond's kind of tricky because in terms of damage, there's a fair amount of property loss, but there is no recorded loss of life there, which is absolutely wonderful considering the magnitude of this flood. In terms there, they were comparing it to this flood that happened in 1771 because the waters had never risen that high in the perspective of the city. And so it was enough to commemorate it with a photo, which the cover of the book actually has a photo of Richmond and what is Main Street there. And that image is taken outside of where Main Street Station now stands. So that famous clock tower, that's exactly where that is. They spend this entire day saving both all this tobacco that's in Mayo's warehouses. There are homes that are in the lower area of the city that are just inundated, so they're pulling out whatever personal property they can to move that to higher hills. But the actual impact was it was a combination of the socioeconomically disadvantaged that lived closer to the waterfront, and some of the businesses that end up around the Main Street area and in that section. That Mayo's Bridge was swept off, and in fact, there was at that point the citizens of Richmond had gathered on a hill to watch whether or not this bridge was going to go, and so they were spending this day in the sunshine, just watching and waiting. And so it was almost like bets on like when this bridge was going to take off and go down the river. And luckily, like the police had made sure nobody was on it, so when it did eventually, give way, nobody was harmed in that instance. But yeah, it's kind of a day of moving things onto the hills into higher ground, and then the gasworks goes out. So Richmond that spent the evening in darkness, and so there are all these little campfires that kind of light the city from the hills from people that have been displaced, and there's a somewhat eerie story about, besides the campfires, there was a light from one of the boats, and like there was one lamp from that one gas lamp that was within inches of the high watermark of the flood. That was the only one that didn't go out, and so people were just watching this lamp, waiting on it to go. And
wow, you get into such great detail, and you imagine that you're sitting there and you're seeing the waters rising and rising and rising, and you're just waiting. And it's just amazing. And we have a winner for the second trivia question. And the
We
winner
do have
is?
a winner. Congratulations, Michelle D'Amato. She came up with the
Hey,
correct answer, the chain bridge. I will say that we had a lot of guesses. We
congratulations.
had a lot of guesses for the long bridge, but the chain bridge was the correct answer. So, Michelle, congratulations. And I have your
Great.
address on
Congratulations.
file.
Yes.
If it's a good
Yeah.
time to show
I
photos, we
have
do
the
have a
books,
photo of the
so
chain bridge.
I will
And
send. I will be sending the books out. I have the books. They were sent to me. So
I'll show those photos of the chain bridge.
right,
yeah.
that's a good idea. Um, so we'll ask the final trivia question. And we'll choose up on their natural disaster. And on October 8th, 1871. No, sorry, I was right the first time. October 10th, 1871. Two fires occurred on the same day, and both are considered amongst the most devastating in U.S. history. One is very well known, but the other was much more devastating and is not as well known. Name both those fires. So let's talk about rebuilding
Okay.
efforts then and efforts now. So talk about how you rebuilt back then. How did you rebuild your lives, your city, and what did it take?
Well, a lot of it was based on the goodness of your neighbors and those that were willing to go out and, fundraise for this event. Um, there, there's in chapter 4, I devote the entire thing to rebuilding efforts and do several case studies about how relief was handled in Harpers Ferry, Lynchburg, Richmond, and Page County, and each one kind of has a different take on it. And there's also a statewide Virginia legislative relief fund, and that kind of came into being. One of a gentleman whose family was impacted by the flood. He was in New York at the time on business and and did a letter to the New York Times, essentially saying, this is devastating what's going on in Virginia. Let's if you can donate it to it. And so there were some larger philanthropists, and I think the Gold Exchange also donated to this particular fund, that with the donations to be sent directly to Governor Walker, who was the governor of Virginia at the time. And a side note of things in history, Virginia and West Virginia had not been 100% severed at that point in time. There was a Supreme Court case where Virginia was suing to reclaim Jefferson County and part of the panhandle of West Virginia. And so relief funds were sent to the governor of Virginia, and in some instances with the expectation that they would also be distributed to West Virginia. I don't believe that was ever done, but that was just a side note there, that there was this lasting little bit where they were trying to decide that in the Supreme Court, and I think that case ended up being decided in January or February of the following year. But the Governor Walker gets these funds, and tries and ends up setting up a committee to try and distribute, to the other localities. So that's going on as a piece of it. And there are these local relief entities that are trying to raise locally. And Harpers Ferry has their own relief fund, and they end up getting a lot of donations from Baltimore. That's where a significant portion comes from. Page County ends up. They had a relief fund set up, but I guess a few weeks after the flood happened, the Committee of the Corn Exchange in Alexandria gets together and says, we want to help you out, and we're gonna help fundraising. And essentially they send out a delegation to Page County, Warren County, Shenandoah County, and Rockingham County. And if there was not a relief committee already started in those locations, they heavily encouraged that happening. So once that happened, then there's also kind of this money and particularly physical goods coming in from Alexandria. And do you have time for me to read you a quote? Because I feel like this
Sure.
is a very telling thing. This is in the Alexandria Gazette from October 22nd, 1870. The wants of the people are great. In most instances, those who need help at all need everything. They are entirely and utterly destitute of household utensils of all kinds, beds and bedding, furniture and clothing. Let no one be deterred from contributing because they only have old articles to give. For we assure you that you can give nothing, no matter how dilapidated or worn, that will not be thankfully received by some poor creature who has lost all. And I don't know, that one, kind of speaks to me in terms of, give what you can. It doesn't matter if it's a bent fork, that's more than what they have.
Yeah. Well, we talked about this, and you fast forward to today's world, and FEMA steps in. You have your insurance. A company comes in, sucks the water out of your house, dries it up, and the reconstruction guys come in. They tear out the drywall, they put in new drywall. All the appliances, furniture, everything gets thrown out, gets replaced with new stuff. Back then, you had to rely on the goodness of your neighbors and friends and people you didn't know to get any scrap to rebuild your life.
Yeah.
And it's just remarkably how times have changed in 150 years.
I didn't do a case study on Albemarle County, but there was a miller named Mr. Wiltsey who lost his home and a couple members of his family. In fact, his two small children and wife were not able to get out of the house before his house was swept away, and he had an older son that was away at boarding school. And so in the end, he and his older son are the only members that remained of that family. He wrote a letter to her in Norfolk, and so it's one of the only firsthand perspectives we get, wherein he essentially says his house was smashed to atoms, and that he had only survived by the goodness of his neighbors. That was, it really was relying on neighbors and clergy as well at the time, because a lot of the efforts were led by local churches as well.
Right. Do we have a winner on the third question yet?
We do. We have a winner. Michelle D'Amato was the first one, but she only closely beat out Nancy Parlett, who who got it. The Chicago fire and the Peshtigo fire up in northern Wisconsin, and of course Chicago, Illinois. Nancy Campbell Gorski also rang in with the correct answer, and Lisa Williams said, "Hi, Ralph." So. Thank you everybody for watching.
That's awesome.
Yes, we got a nice group of followers. We love every one of them. They're a lot of fun, and they're very competitive, as you can tell. And so let's get on to one of my favorite subjects you touch on in your book, and that is the disenfranchised. Between socioeconomic and racial, a lot of people were ignored, never made their names in the newspaper. And then I tried to draw a comparison to Pompeii and Herculaneum, right? And it didn't work, because I found out that Herculaneum was wealthier than Pompeii, but just that Pompeii was enormous. So it's not just wealth, I guess it's influence. And what are your thoughts on that? Has anything changed since 1871 when you look at Superstorm Sandy, Katrina, and all the others? Do the wealthy get more attention than the folks below the poverty line that are in a different economic place?
I think it's getting better. I do remember hearing stories in Katrina where a lot of the socioeconomically disadvantaged folks had their stories told more often than 150 years ago. So I do think that it is moving in the right direction. I know that it's sometimes maybe easier for the media to focus on wealthier or well-known, individuals, and so there were times that if someone prominent in the community lost something, that you would hear more about that than you would those that had less. But I think it's very important to tell all of those stories, and there. I think I talk about this a little bit in the introduction. There was this woman who I think she's pretty fierce when you hear her story. She was an elderly African American woman from Page County whose house was swept away, and she ended up on the roof. And the roof goes all the way down the river to past Harper's Ferry. So that Saturday morning, essentially the same time you're hearing the John Warnweg story, a couple hours later, you see this elderly woman come past the town, and she is on top of this roof smoking a pipe just calmly. And there is an sort of an attributed quote to her where she's also picked up in Berlin / Brunswick, Maryland. And so she's picked up there, and there is, a little bit of a thing, but her name is never mentioned. And if you think about that, like the amazingness of her story, if that had been, pretty much anyone else, we would have had a name, and yeah. So I think, it's harder in terms like that. Plus, there are no firsthand perspective stories from African Americans, and that's when there are so many people that have been impacted by that. Like the fact that that either stories were not collected or by archives. Like losing those sources is just it's its own tragedy to not have all of those perspectives.
Yeah, it's sad, but even in today's world, you hear about the uber rich's house that got washed away, but you don't hear about the shop owner that lost everything on the Jersey Shore that got washed away.
Yeah.
So it comes down to the combination of socioeconomic and or racial that it's one group always gets the story told, one doesn't.
Yeah. But I think, I hope, it is my hope for the future that we will, collect those stories and be able to tell, different perspectives. And
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you for being on. I think you've told our viewers a lot about the flood. It's a very interesting work. She writes very well and puts you in that scene with the people going through the tragedy. So it's not just for history buffs. It's like mini novels within the book. Well, thank
you. This has been my pleasure to talk about it. I thank you so much.
And in 2 weeks, on Election Day, we have an author, Rick Murphy, who wrote a book, The First African Slaves in Virginia. So that'll be another very interesting conversation and very timely. So, and their stories too are wonderful, of what they went through as they came ashore here in America.
It's exciting. Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you all again.
Yes,
Yeah.
Paula, thank you so much for coming on. Ralph, another wonderful show. You have a very devoted, wonderful audience that like to answer the trivia questions, and it's just really fun for everybody. So thank you again for another wonderful interview. And it sounds like a wonderful book, Paula. I'm adding it to my list. I really do love reading works of historical nonfiction like that. So anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on ZTV Live, and you guys enjoy the rest of your evening.
Much.
Sure thing.
Great.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Take care.
Thanks again.
Yep. Okay, so that's going to do it for us at ZTV Live here tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in tomorrow night. We are excited to announce our new show, Wellness Wednesdays, with Dr. Lauren Fisher of the Delray Wellness District. She will be on here with two of her guests. It's going to be a recurring show certain Wednesdays. So please tune in tomorrow night for the debut of that. We're really excited about it. Thursday night, Allison Preby will be back with her Buzzworthy show and with her guest Maggie O'Neill, a local artist. So we're looking forward to that show as well. It's going to do it for us tonight for ZTV Live. So as much as you can, please remember to be kind and to be the good news in someone's life.